Well, you know the topic tonight. The Baltimore Sun was good enough to remind all of you today. We could have saved ourselves the trouble of reminding you earlier. But in any case, our topic is Islamism. What is it? Where is it going? I spoke with Dr. Pipes a while ago and said the obvious. Excuse me for 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. Sir, if you would. Oh, please. Please, that's right. I'm easily distracted. I mentioned to him that, of course, a lot of us are really concerned about what we think is one of the gravest problems facing our nation today, and that is all the uncertainty surrounding Islamist extremism. And we've had speakers who have said, don't worry, it'll pass. Others have said it's a powerful problem. We all know that it's had its ups and downs, and it now exists in Africa and Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East. To some extent, the United States. It's a kind of a mystery as to exactly how strong it is, its dynamics, its durability. And while chatting in that direction with Dr. Pipes, he suggests, well, you want to know what it is and where it's going, which is his nice, succinct way of getting to the point. And that's exactly what we do wish. Dr. Pipes addressed this council once before, 10 years ago, on the subject of Islamic extremism, and the problem hasn't gone away since then. I should note, by the way, of the 130 or so programs which are on YouTube now that the council has presented, the fourth most watched is his presentation from 2007. In any case, he's known to many of you. He's a graduate with his Ph.D. from Harvard. He taught at Harvard a bit. He taught at the University of Chicago. He's been active intellectually, which is a kind of an understatement. He's been head of the Middle East Forum, which he organized when he was also working at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, which, by the way, publishes Orbis, which he edited for a period of time, which, of course, is one of the Orbis being one of the best of the foreign affairs journals. He's published 16 books, over 1,400 articles, 700 book reviews. He's been a student in a profound sense of the Middle East and many aspects of its policies. He's been published in all of the journals that most of you would think are respectable. I led to a titter that I probably don't deserve on that, because I really mean they are serious journals and of every vantage point. In any case, his credentials are impeccable. He's spent several decades as a student of the Middle East and of these matters. It's a great pleasure to present Dr. Daniel Pipes.
Thank you, Dr. Bird, and I most appreciate the warm introduction. I come to you not from the south in Washington, but from the north of Philadelphia. We don't often come here. It's good to be here. It's a privilege to be back, and I'm honored that the council stood by me when it came under criticism. What we're referring to is something called the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee put out an item a few days ago, said, take action, cancel lecture by anti-Arab and anti-Muslim activist Daniel Pipes. Well, here we are. They didn't do it. It is a big topic, and I could speak for many hours, but I won't. I will take up a number of topics. Who is the enemy? How dangerous is this enemy? What are its methods? How is it doing? How's it doing in the West? And how should we respond? So lots of topics. I'll try to keep my introductory comments short so there's plenty of time for discussion. Now, back on 9/11 itself, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. And it quickly became clear that that wasn't really what this was about. Terror was no more the enemy than, say, surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor was the enemy in World War II. There was something deeper. And it's, I think, very important to define who the enemy is. Just as a physician cannot treat a disease without identifying and naming it, so strategists cannot take on a conflict without naming the enemy and identifying who that is. There are three major views of who the enemy is. The first is what I call the establishment view, which holds that it is something murky, terrorists, that it is violent extremists, evildoers, some rather undefined force out there that doesn't like us. I don't think this is a useful approach because it is obviously euphemistic and vague. A second viewpoint is what I call the insurgent viewpoint, that says Islam is the enemy, that it's always been the enemy since the 7th century. This is a viewpoint that is growing stronger. It was hardly around 20 years ago, and there's quite a few adherents in the public's discussion today. There are three major problems with this. The first is that it's ahistorical. It ignores changes. If Islam has always been the enemy, how come we weren't hearing about it a few decades ago? It assumes that there's no change possible. Secondly, it turns friends into enemies. Clearly, some Muslims are not the enemy. Indeed, they are the enemy of this extremist version of Islam. And thirdly, it doesn't allow for any possible war goals. If Islam as a whole is the enemy and all Muslims are the enemy, what are we as Americans to do about this? We're not about to engage in a crusade. So I would argue that there's a third approach that is neither misty nor saying that it's Islam, but rather a form of Islam. It's not terrorism, it's not Islam, but what you might call a terrorist version of Islam, extreme version of Islam. It's a particular reading of Islam. It applies the Islamic law, the Sharia, in its entirety. One way of summing it up is the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, quote, Islam is the solution, unquote. It is a faith translated into an ideology, and often a totalitarian ideology. It seeks to create an Islamic order, a caliphate, in which Muslims dominate, in which the Islamic law is applied. Muslim supremacism is the key. It is hostile to anything that is non-Muslim, and in particular to the West, and most especially to the United States. There's a drive to power, domestically and internationally. In sum, radical Islam is a version of Islam that emphasizes its most severe, legalistic, misanthropic, misogynistic, triumphalist, millenarian, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Hindu, and jihadi qualities. Now, secondly, how dangerous is this phenomenon? I have some rather colorful quotes of former American government employees dismissing it. William Odom, former director of the National Security Agency, jihadism is a mosquito bite compared to communism. Or Ralph Peters, a prominent military analyst. Islam today is composed of over 1 billion essentially powerless human beings, so Islam fights and will fight within its meager but pesky capabilities. Nothing. I disagree. I think it is comparable, Islamism, this form of Islam that is the enemy, radical Islam, political Islam, totalitarian Islam, call it what you will, but this form of Islam offers a compelling vision of utopia that attracts very capable and quite a few people. My estimate would be that some 10 to 15% of Muslims ascribe to this version of Islam. That's a very large number, 150 million, 200 million. It is comparable in this sense to fascism and communism in that it is a modern, radical utopian ideology. Now, it differs from them. It has this religious quality. It is non-Western. It doesn't dominate a great power state, unlike Germany or the Soviet Union or China. But it does have an awful lot of adherents. It has a religious appeal, which probably runs deeper than those atheistic ideologies had. It has a machinery for electoral success. It has potential access to weapons of mass destruction. It has shown some great competence. For example, in Turkey, over the past 15 years, it has proven quite adept at governing. I would call Islamism an Islamic-flavored totalitarianism. I would argue to you it is not a mosquito bite, but a very worthy enemy. Third, about methods. Islamism has two main forms. The one that's more often noted is the violent form, the jihadi form. The blowing up, the destruction, the murdering, the suicide bombing. It has its strengths, to be sure, but in the end, is it conceivable that these violent efforts is in the end, is it conceivable that these violent efforts will succeed in overthrowing powerful states such as the United States or China or Russia or, for that matter, Egypt or India or Morocco? I don't think so. I don't see how, in the face of law enforcement, the intelligence services, the military, the judicial system, these violent jihadis, these violent Islamists are going to succeed. There is another approach, the nonviolent, the lawful form of Islamism, which I think is far more threatening. In other words, in my view, it's not the jihadi who engages in some form of violence, but rather the Islamist who is sophisticated, who is working in the fields of education or the law or politics or media or philanthropy, who is not going to arouse people's fear, who's not doing something alarming. And that is someone who can turn the culture, who can push for an accommodation of the Sharia of Islamic law. So the war on terror is a very, very poor term. It is not about violent enemies primarily. It is also those who are working from within and termite-like changing who we are. To give you one example, there's a long tradition in the West of forbidding polygamy. Well, in certain parts of the West, notably in Great Britain and Ontario, Canada, it is legal to have polygamous marriages so long as they were contracted in a country, in a place where polygamy is legal. So if you come to Britain with a legal polygamous marriage, it is legal in Britain. This is a major shift that almost no one has paid attention to, but it's a sort of shift that we see taking place all over. Fourth, about trends. I would argue, and I'm alone in arguing, that Islamism is actually in decline. I think it reached its peak about 5-6 years ago. At that time, you saw that the lawful Islamists and the violent Islamists, the Sunni Islamists and the Shiite Islamists, the monarchical Islamists and the Republican Islamists, the Salafis, the ones with long beards, and the Muslim Brothers, the ones with beards like mine, cooperated. They could work together. They had a single goal of establishing Islamic law and building towards a caliphate. But in recent years, all that's broken down. Look at Syria, where the Sunnis and the Shia are at each other's necks. Look at Egypt, where the Salafis and the Muslim Brothers are at each other's throats. Look at Turkey, where the President Erdogan and the leading cultural Islamist, man by the name of Fethullah Gulen, are in a mortal combat. Wherever you look today, the Islamists are fighting each other. They're weaker than they used to be. That's point one. Point two is that Muslim populations who have had the experience of living under Islamist rule don't like it. The most dramatic instance was in Egypt in 2013, where after 1 year of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, they said, no thank you. And in what appears to be the largest political manifestation in human history, they got rid of him. Another reason why it's weakening is ISIS. ISIS presented a version of Islam that was so extreme, so repulsive, that many Muslims said, no thank you. As a result, I conclude that Islamism, broadly speaking, around the world, is getting weaker rather than stronger. Fifth point, the West. The West defined as Europe and the Americas. There were very few Muslims living in the West. They were peripheral until a variety of changes took place 50, 60 years ago. In 1961, the German government signed an agreement with the Turkish government to bring Turkish laborers to Germany, Gastarbeiter. In 1965, a major overhaul of the American immigration law changed it fundamentally to allow far more peoples from non-European backgrounds. These and other steps led, on the one hand, to an acceptance of Muslim immigration, and on the other hand, the turmoil of the Muslim world, the civil wars, the international wars, the poverty, the repression, caused many Muslims to want to leave and come to the West for economic reasons, for intellectual reasons, for religious reasons. And so there has been a very substantial movement of Muslims to the West, especially Europe. If you look at Europe and it's on the map, you see that it's more or less surrounded by Muslims from Morocco to Siberia. Many of them are very close. Gibraltar is, I think, 10 miles away from Morocco. An island of Italy is some 40 miles from Tunisia, and so forth. And so given the prosperity and freedoms of Europe, it's not surprising that and given modern transportation and communications, it's not surprising that large numbers of Muslims have sought to move to the West. And this has created a whole range of tensions, in large part because the Islamists among them, the ones with the political agenda, the ones seeking supremacy, the ones seeking the application of Islamic law, they have pushed for Sharia, for Muslim rights against the native populations. And so tensions have been sparked all over. The first real clear manifestation of this was in 1989 with the Rushdie affair. You may recall that Salman Rushdie, an Indian-born Muslim novelist, wrote a quite sacrilegious book about Islam. And the Ayatollah Khomeini condemned him to death and condemned the publishers of the book. And this led to a crisis whereby, for the first time, out of Iran, more broadly out of the Muslim world, came an edict that said, this man must die. Fatwa, more or less. And from that time on, we've seen a repetition of threats. If someone says something, does something that's not acceptable to the Islamists, they will threaten and they will attack. Think of the Charlie Hebdo attack almost exactly 3 years ago in Paris. But that's hardly the only issue. There are many others: female genital mutilation, honor killing, and the imposition of halal, which is like kosher but for Muslims, halal strictures on food in public institutions, and so forth. So there are a range of tensions that have developed. And if you go to Europe, Western or Eastern, you'll find that this issue of Islam, the Quran, minarets, mosques, Sharia, Muhammad, and so forth are very prominent topics, arguably along with the European Union, the most prominent political topics. And what you see in Europe, much more so than here, is a very intense debate where the establishment says, this is fine, this is good. We need fresh blood. We don't have enough children. We need cultural renewal. we need diversity, we need multiculturalism, this is a good thing. The EU in particular argues that. Just a few weeks ago, one of the key figures there said, get used to it. This is life, more are coming, this is good for us. But at the same time, especially among working class Europeans, there is a resistance, there is a reluctance, there is a sense that life is changing, that mores are changing, that cultures are changing, languages are changing, and there's a reluctance to go this way. Increasingly what you see in Europe is a pushback. Parties which did not exist 20, 30 years ago are now getting 20, 25, 30% of the vote, are by and large excluded from the public debate, are seen as far right and neo-Nazi and extreme and illegitimate. But they're really not. There's more expressions of a concern about what's taking place. The numbers are growing consistently. I like to point to the numbers in Sweden, where they have almost exactly doubled. The party involved, the Sweden Democrats, had less than 0.5% in 1998. They have elections every 4 years, and doubled that in 2002 and 6, 10, 14, and on the cusp of elections in 2018, it's again more or less doubled its vote, or in the polls. Its polling is showing a more or less double to about 25%. They're growing like topsy. And most interesting of all is that in one Western European country, in Austria, only a month ago, exactly a month ago, December 18th, for the first time in Western Europe, an anti-immigration and essentially anti-Islamization party came to power. Austria is not a country many of us watch closely, but it is a startling development. 58% of the Austrians voted for the two parties that stood against immigration and Islamization. I don't know how they're going to do. It's only a month old, but I think it's very important for the future of Europe, how much Islamization, how much immigration there will be, how much it will be stopped. I would urge you to keep an eye on that. And finally, last point concerns responses to this, to the Islamist threat. Second last point on the causes of Islamism. Why is it so popular? There tends to be an interpretation that it has to do with lack of opportunity, lack of education. This is what I'd call a materialist explanation. We tend to all to be materialists. We look at money. We look at material goods as the explanation. But I would argue that in this case, at least, that's not the cause. If you look closely at the Islamists, you will see that they tend to be quite fortunate. To take one study by a scholar named Mark Sageman, he looked at 400 al-Qaeda members some time ago, and he found that 3/4 of them came from the upper and middle class. Moreover, quote, the vast majority, 90%, came from caring, intact families. 63% had gone to college, as compared to the 5 or 6% that's usual in the third world. These are the best and the brightest of their societies, unquote. Nor were they unemployed or isolated. Far from having no family or job responsibilities, 73% were married and the vast majority had children. 3/4 were professionals or semi-professionals. They are engineers, architects, and civil engineers, mostly scientists, unquote. These are not the wretched of the earth. It's not lack of education, it's not economic privation, it's not Western colonialism or neo-imperialism, it's not U.S. foreign policy, it's not psychological disturbance. Rather, it has to do with deep questions of identity, a sense of frustration and envy due to the weakness of the Muslim world today. In other words, historically, to be a Muslim meant to be on a winning team. The Prophet of Islam fled his city, Mecca, and went as the ruler to Medina. Within 100 years of his death, the Muslims had conquered areas from India to France. In the medieval period, it was Islam that was the dominant civilization. The great cities were places like Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus. This is where commerce and the arts and the sciences were most developed. So there developed an assumption that to be a Muslim was to be on God's team, to be favored by God both spiritually and in a mundane way. And that worked for 600 years, roughly speaking, from 600 to 1200. And then for another 600 years, Muslims didn't really watch what was going on in the West and in Europe. And then about 1800, another 600 years later, they became very aware. The symbolic change was the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon in 1798, when suddenly the weight of modern Europe, France, with its advanced technology, its sciences, its industrial capabilities, its organizations, its finances, its sciences, it just all came down to bear on Egypt, and they won immediately. And the same thing happened all over with the European colonialism, the economic domination, and so forth. And as a result of this European domination, the question came up, what went wrong? Why are we no longer God's favored? Why are we at the bottom instead of the top? And the Islamist answer said, we're at the bottom because we're not following the laws of Islam. If we apply the laws as they used to be applied, or at least as they thought used to be applied, then we will be strong again. So Islamism is an answer to the question, what went wrong? It is an attempt to get strong again. It's not about privation on the personal level. It is about weakness on the level of the ummah, the Muslim community. Finally, to discuss Western responses. I don't think this is an ideology that can be appeased, nor do I think it can be bought off. I don't think a change in foreign policy will make a difference. Say the United States broke relations with Israel and left Iraq and took other major steps to change its foreign policy. Surely this deep ideological drive of Islamism wouldn't change. I would argue that just as Islamism is comparable to fascism and communism, so our response needs to be comparable to that of fascism and Islamism. We defeated fascism in 1945 through hot war, total victory. We defeated communism in 1991 through a Cold War. But we understood that these were threatening ideologies that had to be defeated and marginalized. Counterterrorism is not the answer here. Rather, we must induce Islamists to give up their ideology. This means, in particular, helping Muslims who have an alternative vision of Islam. The anti-Islamist Muslims, sometimes called reform Muslims or moderate Muslims, offer a way out. We who are not Muslims cannot make that offer. It is only Muslims who are thinking about what it means to be Muslim in the year 2018 who can offer something that's alternative, that's an improvement on this totalitarian ideology. Our goal must be to help create an Islam that is modern, moderate, democratic, humane, liberal, and good neighborly, one that grants non-Muslims equal rights with Muslims, one that is respectful of women, homosexuals, atheists, and many others. Today, there are moderate Muslims, there are anti-Islamist Muslims, and their numbers are growing, but they are still small in number and weak and without much financing. It may look unlikely that they could ever prevail, but I think it's possible, and we should be helping them. We should be saying no to the Islamists, and we should be saying yes to the reformists. We should be helping them. We should be congratulating them and celebrating them and giving them opportunities. They're the ones who should be teaching at the institutions of learning. They're the ones who should be on the media. They're the ones who should be talking to you. I am hopeful that they are making progress. Certainly, I see more of them doing more interesting work than, say, 2 decades ago, but it's a long way to go. They do exist. They are getting organized. They are publishing books. They are translating the Quran. They are coming up with new ideas. Interestingly, Iran is a major source of ideas. It's a little comparable to the Soviet Union being a place where anti-communism was developed into a fine art. And so anti-Islamism is being developed in Iran. But in many ways, they need to come here to the West to find the freedom of expression to develop these ideas. The two kinds of leaders that are most needed are theological, studying the Quran, the Hadith, the sacred scriptures, and political, the leaders public leaders who will charge ahead. So in conclusion, this is not a clash of civilizations. The great debates are internal. Among Muslims, the great issue is, what does it mean to be a Muslim at this time? And in the West, the great intra-Western debate is, are we prepared to defend our civilization from this new ideological threat of Islamism? Put differently, it's not a clash of civilizations, but it's a clash of civilization versus barbarism. Thank you.
Dr. Pipes will take your questions, and he'll repeat the questions for the benefit of the camera. We'll continue the session until about 12 minutes after 7.
Looks like I just got another 2 minutes. Sir, was it a fatwa against Salman Rushdie? Well, I demurred when you said that before it was a fatwa. Strictly speaking, it was not a fatwa. A fatwa requires someone to go to a religious leader and ask for an authoritative interpretation of what's taking place. So, for example, if you're maintaining halal, if you're keeping halal, which again is like kosher for Jews, halal means no alcohol. So you're looking at investments and you want to buy Delta Airlines, but they serve alcohol on Delta Airlines. Is that enough for you not to buy? Does that make Delta not halal? Or is it such a minor part of its operations that it doesn't really matter and it's okay to buy it? So you would go to your religious authority and ask him, may I buy an airline stock or a hotel stock? And they would give you a reading. No one asked Khomeini for this reading. He just came up with it. He watched what was taking place on television. He was outraged. He was outraged by the title of the book, which, to make a long story short, he understood the word satanic verses to imply that the whole of the Quran comes from Satan. He was outraged by this. He put out this edict. And so I don't call it a fatwa, but it's similar. So, what about ISIS after the fall of Mosul? Is it defunct or is it still alive? Well, what is defunct is the state, the size of Great Britain, that existed for some 3 years, from June of 2014 till the fall of last year, in Syria and Iraq, where ISIS or Daesh ruled and had a currency and had a legal system, educational system, and so forth. That's gone. What still exists is what you pointed to, namely the fact that its fighters fled, and who knows where they're going to regroup and what mischief they will cause. So far, not much, but potentially, who knows? Secondly, the ISIS ideal remains this most extreme of extreme forms of Islamism, more extreme than which you cannot imagine. That is a Platonic ideal of Islamism that attracts other groups, such as, say, Boko Haram in Nigeria, or Shabab in Somalia, or Taliban in Afghanistan. Thirdly, what still exists is the notion of the caliphate. This is interesting. The caliphate was an institution that developed on the death of Muhammad, the Islamic prophet, in 632. It was the ruling institution of the Muslim world for roughly 3 centuries. And in the 940s, the caliphate was pushed to the side. The caliph was pushed to the side by others who ruled in his name. And the caliphate continued to exist through the centuries, but was a shadow of its former self. And rulers such as the Mamluks of Egypt and the Ottomans of Turkey took this title among their many titles. And so the caliphate continued, but there was not a caliph. And finally, in 1924, Ataturk, the ruler of Turkey, modern Turkey, abolished the caliphate. And for Islamists, this is something that stung and they hated. And suddenly, 90 years later, in June of 2014, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declares the caliphate and is a caliph and is making decisions. So the first time in 1100 years, there's an executive caliph making decisions. This is remarkable. It would be like a Roman emperor suddenly appearing. Amazing and thrilling to some people and appalling to others. And he had his run, and he did rule, and now he's gone, or at least he's no longer caliph. But the idea remains. And I think that now that he has revived the notion of an executive caliphate, others might be tempted to follow. The king of Saudi Arabia, the president of Turkey, the supreme guide of Iran, who knows who else might be tempted to declare himself caliph. The first question was about Sharia. Is it a real threat, even though it's only in one country? Actually, it is in more than one country. The Saudis have it, the Iranians have it, the Sudanese have it, increasingly other countries have it. It is a goal towards which the Islamists aspire, to apply Sharia. It's difficult. Sharia is not an easy law to live by. I'll give you lots and lots of examples where it's cumbersome or impractical, but nonetheless it is the goal. Is it a threat? Yes, it is a threat, because the Islamists wish to apply it in new places. And if you go to Europe, you will see in places like Great Britain and Sweden that, I give you one example with polygamy, you will see that laws have adapted. You will see that there are major changes concerning public schools, bars, hospitals, and so forth. There are accommodations of Sharia that take place throughout the West, especially in Western Europe. As for the second question about calling the problem, using the term Islam or Islamic or Islamist to refer to the problem, does that not rile up Muslims? No, I don't think so. If you look at moderate Muslims, Reform Muslims, anti-Islamist Muslims, they use the term. How do you think, say, in Saudi Arabia, where this is an acute problem of violent jihadis, they talk about them as Islamiyun. They have actually back-translated from English. We came up with the term Islamist, or the French actually did originally, and they got it from English, and they call them Islamiyun, which would be the Arabic version of Islamist. No, it is a correct term, it is a precise term, and to avoid it and use words like violent extremists is, to use my analogy of the physician, not to know what you're trying to treat. What's the situation in Iran? My estimate would be that 85% of the Iranian population is alienated and feels hostile towards its government and the government's ideology. It is somewhat similar to the Soviet Union in the 1970s. A powerful and bellicose government making trouble all around the world, but hollow because so few people, so few of its subject peoples accept this, are enthusiastic about it. And the government controls the schools and controls the media and pushes these ideas, communist there, Islamist here. The people aren't listening. There's always 15% who will, but overwhelmingly they don't. And one manifestation of this is the range of social pathologies of drug taking and prostitution and alcoholism and the like, which are rampant in Iran. People withdraw from the public sphere and have their own private lives. So what we saw in 1999 and then in 2009 and the last few weeks, 2017 and 18, are manifestations of this dislike, hatred of the regime, wanting something else. In all cases, they've been suppressed, but they haven't been dealt with. Suppression is one thing, and dealing with it is another, and they haven't been dealt with, and the hostility remains and indeed is stronger than ever. And so I'm convinced that one of these days there will be some provocation that prompts Iranians to go to the streets and, in a perhaps more organized way than has been so far the case, to demonstrate, to protest, to perhaps engage in violence, and to overthrow the regime. I predict without hesitation that this regime will be overthrown. Now, I have no idea when or how, but no question it will be overthrown. And I expect then that the following government will be far more friendly to us. It's quite striking that the mosques in Iran are empty. It's not working. As I mentioned before, the peoples who are living under Islamist rule don't like it and are in a way becoming inoculated. It's like the former Soviet and Eastern European peoples who are inoculated against socialism and communism. The Muslims living under Islamism are inoculated against this extreme variant of Islam. How can one help the reformists? By the way, my mantra is radical Islam is this problem. Radical Islam is the problem. Moderate Islam is the solution. There's no alternative. Well, I mentioned some of the things we can do to help them. We can enfranchise them, employ them as teachers in the media, celebrate what they're doing, fund them. In other words, what I'm saying is that at this moment, it tends to be the Islamists who get the benefits. My organization, the Middle East Forum, is just producing a report on the largest Islamist charity called Islamic Relief, and we find that tens of millions of dollars are going from the taxpayer through the government to this organization. It's not going to the Muslims who are modern and liberal, it's going to the Islamists. They have managed to present themselves as the voice of the Muslim community, and they get the financial benefits. They have the partnerships with law enforcement. They go to the White House and its equivalents in other countries. And this dismays and depresses the anti-Islamist Muslims who think it's hopeless. It's just like it was back in the Middle East or in South Asia, that it's the Islamists who are running the show and who are doling out the benefits to their friends. So I would urge at every level, the police, the universities, the courts, the politicians, to find the moderate Muslims, reform Muslims, and work with them and say no to the Islamists. I'm not saying to arrest them, but it would be like the Ku Klux Klan. You know? It's unacceptable. It's an organization and it's an outlook that is unacceptable, and you don't work with it. Now, on occasion that's happened. The FBI, almost a decade ago, refused to work with one of the most influential Islamist organizations in this country called the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE. There have been other steps in that direction, but overwhelmingly, the establishment, the government, the corporations, the universities, and so forth, have worked with the Islamists. And indeed, ironically, even inter-religious dialogue has been overwhelmingly with the Islamists. They've managed to present themselves as the voice of the Muslim community. They are not. So, to what extent were the British, the French, and the Americans responsible for the Islamist phenomenon in the last 100 years? I'd say not. I'd say if you want to blame European powers, blame Italy in the first place, Russia in the second, and Germany in the third. Why those three? Mussolini, the most important figure. Mussolini was the first totalitarian leader that the Muslim world paid attention to, more so than Lenin, and he offered a model. After all, I mentioned, wouldn't it be bizarre if there were a Roman emperor who appeared? What was Mussolini, right? He was a modern Roman emperor. He was using the power of the state to imply a nationalist, socialist ideology. Now, that's not what the Islamists were looking at, say Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, or al-Maududi in India, or Khomeini in Iran, but they were looking at the methods, and they found these methods very appealing. And then Russia and Germany came along, and those were the models. No, I don't think it was the French, British, and Americans. I think it was the Italians, Russians, and Germans. What do I mean by we should be careful who we let in the country? Well, I appreciate the question, because I've spent a lot of time on that. President Trump, I've managed to avoid that reference until now. 2 years ago, at the beginning of his campaign, or when he was still campaigning, had the idea of a Muslim ban. No Muslims enter the country. That clearly was infeasible, impractical, and he dropped it. And now the more recent version has been to ban nationals of 7 and then 6 countries, all Muslim majority. That too doesn't really work. Passports are not the key. As I like to put it, we have enemies in Canada and friends in Iran. Passport itself is not the key. What you want, again referring to communism, is something along the lines of the McCarran Act of 1951, I believe it was, that forbade communists. We should forbid Islamists from entering the country. Well, what does that mean? In practice, what that means is learning who comes into the country, focusing on their social media activities, on their friends, on their networks, interviewing them and asking them persistent questions on delicate issues to find out who's coming in. It's expensive, it's slow, and it requires expertise, but I think it's a priority for us to protect ourselves from bringing in enemies. If the U.S. response or the Western response to Islamism should be comparable to that of fascism and communism, what does that mean? Well, I am not suggesting we mobilize as in World War II, and I'm not suggesting that it be the Cold War. This is a different phenomenon and requires different responses. I am suggesting that we should see this as a hostile ideology, that we should be very careful about who we allow in the country, that we should treat it as a hostile ideology. We should not be convinced that its softer forms are compatible with our way of life. We should work with, as we work, say, with socialists against communists. We should work with reform Muslims against Islamist Muslims. We should see governments like that of Iran or Turkey as hostile to us, and stop with the notion that Turkey is an ally just because of an alliance that goes back almost 70 years, that is gone. We should be clear-sighted about it, we should identify it, and we should work with Muslims who agree with us that this is a problem. And many Muslims who have fled to the West fled because they were leaving behind. Say, many Iranians wanted to leave behind the Islamism of their native country. They are very valuable resources. They know the phenomenon, they know the languages, they've been living it with all their lives. These are the people who can offer an alternative. So I don't have exact, precise tactics to offer you, but it's a general approach of seeing Islamism as a hostile ideology, and all those who advocate it are, in some way, our enemy. Is what we need, in fact, a crusade? I would say no, that a modern Western country is not capable of engaging in a crusade. We are, at our very roots, a secular country. And that's my problem. If you recall, I began by giving 3 interpretations of who the enemy is. And those who are saying it's Islam, all of Islam, are in fact implying that we need a crusade. But as I suggested earlier, that's not possible. The United States is not going to engage in a religious war. So what we need to understand, we need to see it as an ideology. We can engage in ideology. We did that, as I've said many times, with fascism and communism. If we look at Islamism rather than Islam, then we can handle it. But if it degenerates into religious war, either our country is going to change very much, and I don't think in a positive way, or we will be incapable of fighting it. It has to be done in a way that includes everyone, including Muslims, who don't like this ideology. What about the Arab-Israeli conflict? Well, just as I didn't mention the name Trump, I didn't mention the word Israel. So, welcome at the end. What about the Arab-Israel conflict? Gentleman says that he's always understood that that has been a source of much hostility and perhaps of Islamism. That's a theory that goes by the name of linkage, that the problems of the Middle East, which are legion, the volatility, the anger, the extremism, the violence, is due to Israel. I don't think so. There are many problems in the region. Look around today. Civil wars in Libya and Yemen and Syria, major problems in such countries as Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran building nuclear weapons, Egypt going under economically, and so forth and so on. Turkey becoming rogue. It is difficult to see how all that can be ascribed to Israel. Indeed, Arab-speaking Muslim leaders have generally come to that conclusion. To put it differently, for some 50 years, from roughly 1930 to 1980, the Arab leaders saw anti-Zionism as a very useful tool to mobilize and distract their populations, and it worked. Gamal Abdel Nasser would be the symbol of that, the ruler of Egypt from 54 to 1970. Anti-Israel was his stock in trade, and he became king of the Arabs as a result of that. That wore out among the leaders. By about 1980, which is now close to 40 years ago, they concluded that this wasn't helpful to them, that this was a dangerous trend, that this was a tiger they could fall off of. And so since then, one way or another, they have been trying to reduce, mostly, I mean, occasional exceptions like Saddam Hussein, they've been trying to reduce the emphasis on Israel. And at no time more so than at present, when we hear constantly of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and Jordan and Israel, and Egypt and Israel. And perhaps most dramatically when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the Arab states went as silent as they possibly could. Yeah, they made pro forma statements, such as the Saudis called it irresponsible, but it was the Turks and the Iranians and the Europeans who were vehement about this. So that has that is not the driving force. It used to be you said the Middle Eastern conflict, and everybody knew you meant Arab-Israeli. No longer. The Middle East conflict today is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. What kind of Islam, what kind of relations with the outside world? The Iranians are on the warpath, and the Arab states, such as those I mentioned, are fearful. They have all sorts of economic problems. They have all sorts of issues, such as Islamism, radical jihadism at home, and Israel has moved to the side. So there is a prospect of resolution today that didn't exist before. It is rumored, one hears, that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, beckoned Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to Riyadh and read him the Riot Act. Trump is saying this, you better agree with it. Well, he didn't. But if that actually took place, it is quite a momentous change.
You shouldn't have applauded so quickly. And I apologize especially to our speaker, because he's done yeoman work tonight, covered a wonderful topic as well as I could have expected him to do in that limited period of time. And the answers to the questions were all rich and helpful. However, the chairman of our Board of Trustees would like to ask a question.
Well, Frank and Doctor, thank you very much. I have a teaching moment question. I suppose it's out of ignorance, but a lot of people use the term Muslims and Islamists as synonymously. Please help us to understand the difference.
Muslims are the adherents of Islam. It's the same root, salama, in different forms. Islam is the abstraction. Submission, Muslims are those who submit. It applies to an enormous variety of people over a very long period of time. In Indonesia, in Baltimore. There can be Sufi forms of Islam, which are mystical. There can be ISIS forms of Islam, legalistic forms, and so forth. Well, so ISIS is legalistic. Islamists are those Muslims who believe that at this time, in the modern period, starting about a century ago, the way forward is by applying Islamic law and creating a caliphate. Let me put it in a little perspective. I mentioned that the French invasion of Egypt in 1798 was this traumatic event, as were, say, the British taking of Bengal and other developments, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Russians, the Dutch, the Europeans, even us in the Philippines, taking over Muslim majority areas. And the question arose, how do we fix things? So if you start in 1800, the first 120 years, roughly speaking, the predominant answer was you fix this by emulating France and Britain, by emulating the liberal European states, the most powerful European states. You learn their languages, you learn their approach, and you learn their institutions, their post office, their military, and the like. By the 1920s, this didn't seem to work, and the new idea was you emulate the illiberal Europeans, the Germans and the Russians, the Nazis and the communists. And this predominated for another 60 years, from 1920 to 1980. Starting about 1980, that fell apart. Didn't get them where they wanted to go. And at that point came the turn towards Islamism, which said, don't look abroad, don't emulate any foreigners. Look to your own tradition to see how to become strong and rich. Apply Islamic law as it used to be the case, and then things will work. And that is the main impetus behind Islamism. And Islamists want, one, the caliphate, in other words, worldwide control, and two, application of Islamic law.
Thank you very much.